In this video, we're going to be taking a look at books which are around 200 pages and under, which you could easily read through the rest of next year if you wanted to read a book a month. So, without further ado, let's have a look at them, shall we? Hello out there, all my bookish friends in BookTube land. Welcome to this episode of Tristan and the Classics. If you're new here, pull up a pew, put on a coffee and get ready to enjoy 12 classic books, which are all around 200 pages or under. And the reason I've made this list is because frequently when going into a new year, people, maybe you, want to read more classics or just read more, but you may have had the experience of, like we all have, biting off more than we can chew and stacking up these great tomes like War and Peace and Anna Karenina and burning ourselves out. Well, this video is going to provide you with at least a book a month for next year, which you can absolutely get through without too much effort. So let's crack into our list of 12 in no particular order. First on our list is E.M. Forster's A Room with a View, an absolutely beautiful book of about 210 pages. And it follows the character of Lucy Honeychurch. She's a young girl who starts off in the book in Florence, where she's doing Italy. We're talking around the turn of the 19th century, 19th to 20th century. And she's got a chaperone with her who is a bit dour and a bit of a martyr to her cause. And Lucy sort of bumps into some unusual characters in Italy called the Emersons, a father and a son. And her world is sent out of kilter. This is a book about youth and age and about propriety and spontaneity, about the rigidity of societal mores and what's expected of you and the impulse of the heart. Because when she meets a particular character, she finds unusual sensations within herself. Is it love or is it anger? And then she goes back home to England, where she is reintegrated into her mother's sphere of friends and high society. But the Emersons also turn up in England as well, in the same environment, same neighbourhood. How is this going to have an effect on Lucy, on her relationship with her mother? She has a fiancé called Cecil. How's he going to react to all of this? Will she reveal anything of what happened and took place in Italy? The beautiful thing about this book is Forster, in his very modern way, focuses on saying the things that are not said, but without the omniscient narrator who goes, and what she was thinking was, but actually you hear the characters speak, but particularly Lucy, there's things she doesn't say, and you're actually reading things that are not being said. You've got to read between the lines. It's a really engaging book and a delight to read and a real experience in literature. It's not hard, but it's a real change if you're not used to different kinds of literature and styles of writing. So, A Room with a View by E.M. Forster, fabulous book. Next out of my pile, again no particular order, is a book I've talked about many times before, and it is A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. Now, the online book club, the Classics Reading Lounge, which you can go to on Discord, I'll put a link below. Wonderful place, free community, beautiful community of readers there. Come and join us. I've mentioned to many of them to read this book, and quite a lot have. I don't apologise for saying it again in another video. This is a supremely brilliant piece of work. It is a quiet novella, 102 pages long, I think it is. It follows the story of a Mr. Birkin. He's come from the First World War. He's had a lot of post-traumatic stress. His wife has gone off with another guy, or his girlfriend at least has gone off with another guy. And he takes up work in a small, quiet village in the country of England. And when I say country, I mean the countryside. And he's restoring a fresco, a medieval fresco in this old church. Outside, across the road, next to the church, is another visitor, a Mr. Moon. So we have Birkin and Moon, which I always think would make a great name for a pub. Moon also has come from the war, and he's an archaeologist. He's looking for the remains or the burial ground of one of the ancestors of those in the little village nearby. we see how those two interact, how they appreciate each other, how they interact with a small village community, the daily humdrum routines of a few of the characters, the insights into friendship and what it means to be a kind person appears in this book, but also the link that is always present between us and the past. And the way this book ends is just tremendous. It left me with a smile on my face for days. And if you want to, because it's only 100 pages and you want to read something else in the same month, it's a great book to read alongside The Great Gatsby. Totally opposite in character, but fundamentally looking at a similar question. So there you are, A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. Third on our list is Thomas Hardy's Under the Greenwood Tree. This is a beautiful country idyll. You know, and for Thomas Hardy, it's really optimistic because he often talks about suffering and struggling. But this is a bright, hopeful piece of work set in a place called Mellstock Quire in Wessex, a small village. He captures a bygone age. Thomas Hardy loved Wessex. He loved rural England. And he wanted to capture it for posterity because he writes at the turn of the century and the Industrial Revolution is calling more and more people into the brown and grey towns. In the book, you have this romantic relationship of Dick Dewey and Fancy Day. Brilliant names, by the way. I love those names. But it's not all just happiness and light and froth. There's a certain irony and there's nice humour that laces all of this about, and you have the colloquial speech of the inhabitants who are all down-to-earth, uneducated, sort of farmery types. But there's this mingling of the love affair with a tragedy that took place in Mellstock Quire, which causes us to reflect, a bit like A Month in the Country, causes us to reflect on a bygone, more simple age. And what once was. It's a great book for slowing down. In fact, if you ever could, take this out, because it's only 150 pages, and over the course of a day or two, read it underneath a greenwood tree. Our fourth book is Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey, the shortest of all of the Bronte books, but a real charm, a real delight. It's Anne Bronte's first book before she wrote A Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Now, Anne Bronte is a governess, and that informs her outlook on her story. Ostensibly, the story is a love story, and there's some charming moments in it. There's some beautiful characterization, and this quiet warmth of affinity that we often have between people, particularly between, two lovers. But Agnes Grey, she belongs to a family who aren't particularly rich, so she wants to help out with paying the bills by becoming a governess, so she moves away to be a governess. This recounts her experiences of looking after children of more well-to-do people, and it's quite a damning critique of high-class families, because they want their children to be brought up to be refined and proper and well-educated, but they don't want them to be disciplined. And she's not alone, Anne. Charlotte spots this as well, as does Emily in Wuthering Heights. The effect that has on children and their later life, and how it can malform them if they're not disciplined correctly. But Anne Bronte, particularly for me, is the one that focuses in on how children are affected by their education. There's something that comes out much later in full vivid detail in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. But this, it's just got the lovely central story of Agnes and her beau, or who she wishes was her beau, as well as the introduction of certain characters of older age and what they can bring to the table, and other people who are in responsible positions and how they could act and how they do act. This is a brilliant piece of work and is only, less than 200 pages. In fact, it's 195 pages long. So you could get through that in no time, but it gives you time to think about the book once you've read it. Our fifth book on the list is the brilliant spy novel, The 39 Steps by John Buchan. This follows the protagonist, Richard Hannay, who features in a number of Buchan's works, but this is the most famous. I can't even begin to think how many films have been made on this tale. And how in 110 pages you can cram so much action and intrigue and suspense beats me. No wonder it's been recorded so many times. Richard Hannay, he's a Scotsman who, his dad was Scottish and he grew up in South Africa and then came back to Britain because he wanted to live life in Britain. But he finds it very dull. When one day he comes home to his apartment and there's an American guy in his apartment who is dead. Now when I say he's dead, that's what the man says to Richard Hannay. And Richard Hannay sort of quizzically asks, well, how does it feel to be dead? And they get into a conversation. The man has a secret which he passes on to Richard Hannay. And before long, Hannay's life is going helter-skelter downwards into a political abyss where people are after his blood. You see him venture into Scotland and travel through the wild hills of Scotland, the heather-sown downs that you get over there. And the different characters who quickly appear but are fantastic characters. A book that once you've read it, you'll be pleased you did, and it will stay with you. You'll never forget the story. What I will say, if you want an audio reading of this, I actually have an audio reading on this channel of this book. It's about 3.5 hours long. You can listen to it when you go to bed, and I do it all in a Scottish accent, which is not what you normally hear this book read in. But I decided to do Scottish because Richard Hannay actually is Scottish. Although he grew up in South Africa, his origins are Scotland. So there's our next book, The 39 Steps by John Buchan. Our next book on the list is Eugenie Grandet by Balzac, and I have the Everyman's edition here. It's about 220 pages, but if I show you the font, there you go, the font is there. You can see it's actually quite big font, it's beautiful. The Everyman edition classics are fabulous to read, they're really comfortable, and the paper is really high quality. Anyway, the story of Eugenie Grandet. Eugenie is the daughter of a man called Felix Grandet. He used to be a cooper, that was a barrel maker, and during the French Revolution, he was able to acquire certain amounts of land, and selling some of it off later, he makes quite a large profit. And as time goes by, he acquires some more means as well, more money. And he becomes the mayor of a town, etc. And he's wealthy, well-to-do. But of course, he's getting older and he's a miser. It starts off like parsimony is one thing, but miserliness is another. And what happens is because he's holding on to this money, suddenly people realise he's got to pop his clog soon, and then his young daughter, Eugenie, is going to be the inheritor. And back then, the best way to make money for most people was to inherit it. And so a bit of a competition starts arising of various suitors for Eugenie's hand in marriage. And of course, the nearby village, which is dominated by Felix Grandet's great mansion, they are all very interested in the ins and outs and the competition to get Eugenie's hand in marriage. Now you get introduced to a whole host of characters in this book. Balzac, I love Dickens, and it's probably why I like Balzac. Balzac is a certain Dickensian way of writing. He's sort of the French Dickens, you could say. Not quite as caricatured, but very observant of people's mannerisms, foibles, the quirks and quiddities of all the characters that he comes across. And this book's in particularly good because it's the first book in the La Comédie Humaine, I believe is how you pronounce it in French. That's my best French accent there. Which is about a pile of 80 works, some big, some short. And this is the introductory book to that. So if you love this book, you are then into a whole world of stuff that you can go after written by Balzac. So that was our next book, Eugenie Grandet. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. This is a brilliant book, like really, really good. It's only 141 pages long. However, you will want to read this book slowly. There's a reason. Virginia Woolf, part of, again, the modernists movement, they were trying to push literature, to break its bounds, to not conform to traditional plot and structure and style. This is where you get stream of consciousness coming from. Rather than just having a linear descriptiveness, with stream of consciousness you sort of occupy the minds of characters and they talk in that bitty half-sentence way that we talk to ourselves. So the story, you have Clarissa Dalloway, she's high society, she's going to throw a party for her husband, I think he's a politician if I remember rightly. She's going to throw a party, a soiree, and she's preparing that through the day. And it all takes place in the course of a day. The other side of town, you've got another character called Septimus Warren. Now, he has come back from the First World War and he has what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. And he goes through his life, he's quite broken and crippled, and it's a very, very insightful look at mental health. The way she describes Septimus Warren and the way he looks at the world outside, well, it gives away to me that Virginia Woolf knew exactly what struggling with your mind was like. But anyway, how do these lives intertwine? How do they cross? What does Mrs. Dalloway, what influence is there on her from this unconnected fellow who goes and sees a psychiatrist across the town? Like I say, what's so good about this is you feel like you're taking a walk one day in the 1920s through London and seeing it from its various perspectives. There's nothing wow dramatic in this. It's almost poetry in a novel, the way it's put together. And I think it's a spectacular book. If you really want to test your bounds, I'm not saying it's hard, but it's not straightforward. If you don't understand every sentence straight away, that's fine. You're not meant to. Think about it. Just take the overall impression. But if you want an introduction into sort of stream of consciousness, modernist kind of work, then I would recommend Mrs. Dalloway. It's a very, very good book. Now, by sheer fortuitous happenstance, the next book up is The Warden by Anthony Trollope. And I say it's fortuitous because the main character in this is also called Septimus, as we had a Septimus in Mrs. Dalloway. But they are totally unlike one another, and this was written far before Mrs. Dalloway was written. In the book, Septimus Harding is the warden of a cathedral in a town called Barchester. It's not a grand town, but a town nonetheless. And he's a really good fellow. There's nothing wrong with him. He's meek and he's mild. He cares for his young daughter. He loves his family. He loves his fellow man. But there's a problem. In the belongings of the church are certain almshouses, which were bequeathed some money from the Middle Ages, a will from the Middle Ages. And it's always been paid by the church, but obviously as inflation happens and as the land was improved that had been given to the church, the amount of income brought by that land has gone up, but the money that's paid to the beadsmen, that's the old men who are allowed to live on the church's land, the money that's given to them from the income has not increased from the will of the Middle Ages. And one of the characters, a Mr. Bold, who is a doctor, takes up the cause of the old men who live on the church's land and that they should be getting more money than they do. But this pulls in Septimus Harding, the warden, of whom the book is named after. And it makes him worry that he's not being fair because he wants to have a clean conscience and he loves his fellow man. What Trollope does so delicately in this, and it is very light and whimsical and slow-paced, what he's looking at is how the age of reform in his day, the newspapers, could attack the church for its avarice. But although it was the institution that was causing the problem, the public reading the newspapers would suddenly rain down fire on a particular individual who of themselves wasn't doing anything wrong and weren't particularly obnoxious, which is what Septimus Harding is in this. You get a lot of other characters as well, particularly the Archdeacon, which is Septimus's son-in-law, who's very austere and high pomp, but he's a great character. And we just look at how it's all resolved, because one plot twist is that Bold, Dr. Bold, who is sort of taking the side of the men who live on the church's property, he is also wanting to marry Mr. Harding's, the warden, his younger daughter. So there's a bit of a dilemma. What do you do there? It's a tale about conscience, about morals, about loyalty and principle, but it's very, very well put together. Lots of irony, quite satirical in places, but the greatest part of this is it's only short at about 210 pages, and it's the gateway to a 6-book chronicle called the Barsetshire Chronicles, which take you through more and more of the life of those at the church and the town. It just keeps growing. And no, you don't have to be religious to appreciate it. No, you don't have to know the ins and outs of how high church works. I don't know how high church works, but it's still thoroughly humane and a lovely read. Number 9 on our list is one by Jane Austen, and it is Persuasion. Actually, this is the biggest book on the list. This is 250 pages, but as I say, it's the Everyman edition, so there's large margins on these 250 pages and quite large typeface. Persuasion follows the story of Anne Elliot. She is a daughter of a well-to-do family, but she's sort of she's sort of the donkey of the family. She gets to do all of the grunt work. She's caring, she's quiet, and keeps herself to herself. She's not flamboyant and outgoing to sort of go into high society. She's not driven by the race to the top. And early in her days, she looked to fall in love with a particular man called Wentworth. And she loved him, and she thought about marrying him, but she was persuaded not to by those around her. Some for not so good means, others genuinely thinking they were telling her the right advice. And what this book does, we get reintroduced to the man that she loved in her past. He's now a captain in the Royal Navy. How are things going to work out between them? That's fundamentally the central thread of this book. However, typical of Austen, it's acutely society conscious. It's very perceptive of what makes society tick. And in this book, which is the most serious of all of her books, in my opinion, with Mansfield Park coming close second, this book, she sort of lampoons various characters, like Anne Elliot's father, who is sort of foppish and, an imbecile in the sense that all he's interested in is the family name and dignity and money. And the daughter is impressed by money and society, and they go to Bath, the grand tour, and how they're just bored there. And then they just want to meet people, but they don't make any meaningful connections. Whereas Anne, although she actually gets on with the family just up the road from her, which is a bit more, they're not poor, but they're not high class. The kids love her. Other people love her. She takes care of everybody. She's sensible. She perceives things correctly. And she just enjoys life. And you get quite a number of these characters, like an admiral turns up. He's, full of bonhomie. Now, he may look coarse to the upper set, but who has the best kind of day-to-day living? Who has the most happiness in life? So the word persuasion in this is unusual. Could it be, is it talking about persuading in love, persuading to do or not to do? Or is it talking about the persuasions of our characters and different characters in life? I highly recommend Persuasion, especially if you've read other Austen works and you want to get into another one and you haven't read Persuasion, definitely read it. Because, like I say, it's more of the serious side of Jane Austen, but written with that lightness of touch which is so singular to her hand. Number 10 on the list is a book I have reviewed before, but it's one you may not be familiar with unless you're from South America. And it is Epitaph of a Small Winner, otherwise known as the posthumous memoirs of Bras Cubas, because Bras Cubas is the narrator in this. He is the main character. And as the other title, Posthumous Memoirs, tell you, Bras Cubas narrates this from beyond the grave. He is not just a dead writer in that he's written and is now dead, but he started writing after he died. And he takes a very slanted, squinted view of life, looking back on it and weighing up whether or not his life amounted to anything. You know, was he great in life? Or was his life meaningless and pointless? And the fact that he says it's an epitaph of a small winner means he thinks, and weighing the balance of his life up, he came off doing all right. But the reason he thinks he did well, you will never guess. And it's pretty macabre, to be quite honest. It's pretty sort of comedy noir. Now, throughout this book, I'll show you this. If you look at the chapters here, okay, you notice that's a chapter. That's it. All these chapters are really small. So this is a great book to actually read in bed, if you don't like leaving a chapter open when you go to sleep. And what he does, he starts off with his early days, and sort of takes, it's not haphazard, but it feels a little haphazard at times, a journey through significant moments in his life, as you would if you could speak from beyond the grave. You'd be like, oh, remember that. You know, when we reflect and we tell anecdotes, we don't tell our life in a great, grand, sequential tale. We tell it in bits that we remember. And the bits that matter to him stand out. But he's really funny with them. He talks about position in society, like the role of your job, the role of money, the role of love, the strange falling out between family members. Adultery figures in this. And is it right? Is it wrong? Who should you be a lover to? Now, that sounds all very philosophical, but it's done with a very wry humour. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I need to read this again because there's a lot in this which I know I would have missed first time round, because obviously I'm reading a translation. It should be in Portuguese because Machado de Assis is a Brazilian author. Some call him the greatest Brazilian classic author. Now, I want to go back because there's probably stuff I've missed because of translation which I could get more out of. But just as a straightforward read, an absolute triumph of a book. This will leave you with a smile on your face, okay? And it will be a book I'm pretty much sure 80% of you will recommend to others. In 11th place, we're almost there, the penultimate book, is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. So a very classic modern book, or modern classic I should say. This book follows the character Guy Montag, who is a fireman. Now, I know what you're thinking. A fireman goes around in one of those red machines putting out fires. No. This is set in a somewhat dystopian future. It's not like calamitously dystopian as things like 1984 are, but it's still dystopian. He is a fireman because he burns books. He is a fireman. Books are prohibited. The keeping of ideas beyond the state's framework is something the state doesn't like. Now, we don't get into the political mechanisms of state in this. We just know that that's their opinion. And we actually start with him burning a bunch of books. However, he does stumble across a young girl who lives over the road from him in the street, and she asks questions. And she laughs a lot. And she skips around and she's kind. Now, asking questions is not something that people in this world do. They have become inured to sense by having pleasure all the time. The state lays on lots of pleasurable activities for them, going to the cinema and the bowling alleys and all that kind of stuff. That's all you do, and it keeps the masses sort of quiet. They're just easily pliable. But when this girl starts asking questions, Guy Montag wants to know, where does she get those questions from? And it leads him to being tempted to maybe read a book when he goes to burn them. And then we have the feeling of conscience comes in, of being watched, of dread, of being found out, because the state learns everything. And what effect are these books going to have on Guy Montag? Will the state get involved? How can he keep himself hidden from other people? Because he's going to feel guilty around people because he knows what he's done, even if they don't. Will they pick up on his suspicions? It becomes quite a tense read. And overall, the one thing I'd like you to think of if you do read this book is, what's your opinion of how pleasure and materialism is used to keep a population dumb and obedient? Because that seems to be the main thrust, the idea that prompts Ray Bradbury writing this book, for me anyway. Our final book on the list, and like I say, they're in no particular order, so I'm not saying this isn't any good. This is a very profound book. It is Fathers and Children by Ivan Turgenev, the great Russian writer. You might also see it called Fathers and Sons. Now, this book, I really enjoyed this book. It must be like 180 pages long. It looks thicker because there's lots of notes in here. It follows a lad who comes home from university to his father, who is a wealthy aristocrat. He's a landowner out there in Russia somewhere. And his uncle also lives with his father. But on going away to learn at the university, the lad has met a character called Bazarov. And he is a very intellectual character. And he follows the modern philosophies of the day, a sort of elevation of psychology and political science and the sciences. He sees everything through that lens. And the old order and religions and the old institutions and aristocracy are just nonsense and oppressive to the people. And so you see these two worlds collide. Because the young lad is sort of on the side of his friend Bazarov, but he respects his parents. And there's a particular clash between his uncle and Bazarov, because his uncle really stands for the old guard. What is so brilliant about Turgenev's handling of this book is that most authors, whether they mean to or not, will end up leaning to one side or the other, favouring the changing regimen coming in, or favouring the ancient regime, the old way. And Turgenev doesn't do that. Turgenev treats sympathetically all the characters in his book. Bazarov is not a likeable character, yet you can feel a sympathy for him. He doesn't believe in any kind of show of emotion. And so it becomes very confusing when he meets a girl, or a woman, whom he finds very attractive and enticing, and his heart begins to get involved. But emotions don't make any sense. It's not intellectual. So how does he cope with that? And that woman has a sister, and she plays a role as well in the whole affair. Now, I'm not going to give any spoilers away. You'll have to read this book to find out what goes on in it. Now, it's a thoughtful book. It can be read purely as a novel, but you will know when you read this, as is the case with most Russian literature, you will know there's something deeper to this book. And I don't mean you have to be highbrow and, theorise and philosophise over it, but just ask yourself why you're drawn to certain characters and try not to be prejudiced one way or the other. Try to be Turgenev. He got the ultimate accolade for this book. When he wrote it, the students of his day viewed him as their enemy. And the old guard of the day viewed him as their enemy too. They both thought he was attacking them. He actually wasn't standing on either side. He wasn't in anyone's camp. He just wrote a book. And actually, it's from Turgenev we get the famous word nihilism, because he began to bring this nihilistic attitude into some of his works, particularly in the mouths of the students. So that was our last book, Fathers and Children, or Fathers and Sons, by Ivan Turgenev. An absolutely great book and quite a central book in the Russian canon. So there we are, we've had 12 books in this video. All the books are around 200 pages or less. Some of them are a little bit over, but not by too much. And if you were to read one a month, it wouldn't tax you much. You could sit in bed and read those 10 pages a night, and you would still have like a week or so left without reading each month. And by the end of the year, you're going to have a very varied platter of classic literature that you've read. And you'll find within there, if you're new to the classics, you might find particular areas appeal to you more. And if you want to build on that, then by all means, go and watch my video, How to Build Your Own Classics Library that suits you. It's not just picking all the classics, but ones that fit you. So, I hope you enjoyed that video. Leave your comments. Are there any in particular that you like the sound of and you think you might try and read? And until the next video, I wish you joy in your reading.